The Appalachian foothills of western North Carolina turn a particular shade in November once the leaves are down and before the snow comes. Gray-brown and spare, with the ridgeline showing through in ways they cannot in summer, the bones of the landscape made visible. It is not a harsh beauty, but it is an honest one. The towns that sit in the valleys between those ridges carry their own kind of honesty, small, durable, built around furniture factories and timber operations that have been running for generations, the kind of places where people know each other's grandparents and where the same family names appear on mailboxes and on cemetery headstones with a frequency that speaks to deep roots. Cloverdale, North Carolina had about 4,000 residents in 1986. One high school, 2 elementary schools, a county fair every September, a diner on the main square that served breakfast all day. The closest city was an hour east on a 2-lane highway that followed the river. Most people in Cloverdale did not need the city and went there only for things the town could not provide. Thomas Adler was 7 years old in November of 1986. He was a serious child, as some children are, with an earnestness in his face that adults sometimes found startling in someone so young. He had ash-brown hair, gray eyes behind a pair of small wire-rimmed glasses that he needed to wear all the time, but frequently forgot to. He liked birds. He had a field guide, dog-eared and annotated in his large, careful printing, that he carried in the front pocket of his canvas jacket on the mornings he went out. He knew the names of 43 species by sight. His parents, Walter and June Adler, had lived in Cloverdale since before Thomas was born. Walter worked at the county assessor's office. June taught piano lessons from the front room of their house 3 afternoons a week. They lived on Miller Road, at the edge of town where the houses began to give way to farmland, in a 2-story house that had been painted yellow when they bought it and that they had never gotten around to repainting. The yellow had faded to something closer to cream. Neighbors sometimes still called it the Yellow House, as neighbors do, holding on to a description long after it has stopped being accurate. On the morning of November 7, 1986, a Friday, Thomas ate breakfast at the kitchen table while his mother made coffee. He was wearing his canvas jacket already, which meant he had been thinking about going out. It was a cold morning, well below freezing, and June told him to wait until it warmed up. He agreed and ate his cereal, and then, at some point while June was in the front room setting up for her first lesson of the day, he went out anyway. He left through the back door, which he sometimes did when he didn't want to be heard. He was 7 years old, and this was a small town in 1986, and the back door led to the yard, and the yard led to the fields behind the house. And Thomas knew those fields, and June knew he knew them. He took his field guide. At 9:15 a.m., June finished her lesson and went to call Thomas in for a warmer coat. She went to the back door, into the yard, across the yard to the fence line that separated their property from the first field. She called his name. The field was empty. She called again. She walked the fence line to the far corner where a stand of old pines gave Thomas a natural blind for watching birds. No Thomas. She walked the field. She walked back to the house. She checked the barn at the corner of the neighboring property where he sometimes went to watch the pigeons in the rafters. By 10 o'clock, June Adler had called Walter at the assessor's office, 2 neighbors, and the Cloverdale Police Department. Thomas Adler had been missing for less than an hour. He would not be found for 31 years. The Cloverdale Police Department in 1986 had a chief, 4 full-time officers, and 2 part-time deputies who covered weekends and holidays. It was not equipped for what it was being asked to do. Chief Harold Vance arrived at the Adler property at 10:22 a.m. and walked the same route June had walked, with June beside him, retracing each step as she described it. The field, the pines, the barn. Nothing. A dog from the county sheriff's search and rescue team arrived by noon. It was a bloodhound named Petey, broad-chested and slow-moving but accurate, with a handler named Dan, who had worked 23 searches in the previous 5 years. Dan gave Petey the scent from Thomas's pillow, which June had brought down from his room. Petey moved through the yard immediately, directly to the back fence, through the gate into the field, across the field to the northeast, and then along a drainage ditch that ran parallel to Miller Road toward the main highway. The scent trail ended at the shoulder of the highway, at a gravel pullout where trucks sometimes stopped. "Oh!" Petey circled the area 3 times and sat down and looked at Dan. The highway was State Road 11. It ran east toward the city and west toward the Tennessee state line. In either direction, within the range of a vehicle's movement, the geography became vast. Vance radioed for his officers to begin canvassing the highway in both directions, checking every business and residence within a 10-mile radius. He called the county sheriff and asked for additional personnel. He called the North Carolina State Highway Patrol. At the highway pullout, investigators found several things over the course of the afternoon. The partial impression of a wide tire in the soft gravel at the pullout's edge. A cigarette butt, not yet fully weathered, which suggested recent use, and a scrap of canvas fabric caught on the barbed wire of the fence at the pullout's eastern boundary, above the ditch. The scrap was approximately 2 inches wide, a dark olive green, consistent with the canvas material of a child's jacket. June Adler was brought to the pullout at 3 in the afternoon and shown the fabric through a plastic evidence bag without touching it. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said that Thomas had a jacket like that. She said olive green canvas. She said she had bought it at the general store in August. Her voice did not break when she said it. That came later. Walter arrived at the pullout minutes after June, having left the assessor's office at the first call and spent the morning helping with the field search. He stood with June at the tape line while the investigator explained what had been found. The two of them stood very close together without speaking. A state trooper who was there later said that he remembered the way they stood, as though, if they moved apart, they might not find each other again. The highway checkpoints went up before dark. Every truck stop and service station between Cloverdale and the state line was notified. A description of Thomas Adler went out over the state law enforcement radio network. 7 years old. Gray eyes, wire-rimmed glasses, olive canvas jacket, last seen leaving his yard on Miller Road at approximately 8:30 in the morning. At a gas station 7 miles west on Route 11, the attendant on duty that morning, a young man named Philip, told the trooper who visited that he had seen a vehicle pulled over at the gravel lot beside the station sometime around 8 or 8:30. He had not paid close attention. He thought it might have been a truck, dark, maybe blue. He had not seen anyone get out or get in. He had turned away to help a customer, and when he looked back, the vehicle was gone. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation took over the case on the second day. The lead agent assigned was a woman named Dorothy Marsh, 37 years old, who worked out of the regional office in Asheville. She had a background in fraud before moving to crimes against persons, and she brought to the Adler case a particular quality that the people around her would later describe in various ways: patience, precision, thoroughness. What they were describing, in different words, was the same thing. She did not skip steps. Marsh established a command post at the Cloverdale Town Hall and began working through the evidence systematically. The tire impression at the pullout was photographed and cast. The analysis took 2 weeks and produced a finding that the impression was consistent with a heavy-duty truck tire in a common size used across dozens of commercial vehicles. Not identifiable to a specific vehicle or manufacturer. The cigarette butt was tested for DNA, but the technology for useful analysis of such samples did not yet exist in 1986. It was logged and preserved. The canvas jacket scrap became the investigation's most discussed physical element. It was confirmed to match the weave and color of the jacket Thomas had been wearing. Its location, on the fence wire at the eastern boundary of the pullout, was consistent with a child being moved quickly through that area in a direction that would have been away from the road and toward the ditch and the tree line beyond. Whether it had caught on the wire in a struggle or simply in the normal movement of a small body being carried was impossible to determine. Thomas's known associates were limited in the way that 7-year-olds associates tend to be. His second-grade class was interviewed, each child separately, with a parent present. His teachers were interviewed. His piano teacher, a woman who came to the house on Tuesday afternoons and who had known Thomas since he was 4, was interviewed. All of them described the same child: quiet, attentive, not given to wandering far from the familiar, unlikely to go with a stranger. Unlikely, Marsh noted in the file, did not mean impossible. The sex offender registry for the county and adjacent counties was pulled and worked through. This took longer in 1986 than it would later take, because the records were paper-based and scattered across individual jurisdictions, without a central coordinating system. Marsh requested records from 5 counties and received them over a period of 3 weeks in different formats, from offices with varying degrees of organization. All were interviewed. 2 had not yet been accounted for during the relevant window. Both were eventually cleared, one through a work alibi confirmed by co-workers, one through a more complicated chain of evidence that took 6 weeks to assemble. The media coverage was regional at first and then national within 10 days. A missing child in rural Appalachia, vanished in the cold gray of November, was the kind of story that newspapers ran for weeks and that the evening news returned to periodically. Walter and June agreed to one interview with a Asheville television station, which was broadcast on a Sunday evening. The reward fund, organized by the town and supplemented by donations from people who had seen the broadcast, reached $18,000 by the end of November. The tip line produced several hundred calls in the first month. A woman in Tennessee was sure she had seen a boy matching Thomas's description at a truck stop diner on the Saturday after he disappeared. The boy had been sitting in a booth with a man she did not recognize, eating quietly, not speaking. The man had paid in cash, and they had left quickly. Investigators drove to the diner, interviewed the staff, obtained the name of the woman who had made the call, and spent 2 weeks reconstructing the Saturday in question as precisely as they could. They could not confirm or exclude the sighting. The diner had no surveillance camera. The woman's description of the man was vague. It was documented and kept. The most damaging call came on day 19. A man called the tip line and said Thomas Adler was dead and had been dead since the first day. He gave a location, a ravine in the mountains 8 miles north of Cloverdale, with enough specificity to require a search. The search took 4 days and found nothing. The call was traced to a payphone in a neighboring county. The man was never identified. Walter and June were told in careful terms that the lead had not produced results. They understood what that meant, and they were grateful for the careful terms, and they went on. You have stayed with this story through the early hours and the first terrible winter. What comes next is longer, harder, and more quiet. Stay with it, because the answer did not come from the investigation. It came from a direction that nobody in 1986 could have imagined. The case remained formally active with the SBI for 4 years. Dorothy Marsh checked in on it periodically, requesting updates from the tip line, reviewing any new information that came in. There was not much. The tip volume dropped from hundreds per month to dozens to single digits. By 1990, the Adler file was one of several dozen active missing persons cases in Marsh's region that had produced no resolution, and it was not the freshest of them. She did not close it. She kept it in a separate drawer, not in the open case cabinet where things got shuffled and covered, but in a specific drawer in her desk that she had designated for cases she was not ready to stop thinking about. The Adler case went in that drawer in the spring of 1990 and stayed there until she retired in 2003. The yellow house on Miller Road changed slowly. Walter had the exterior repainted in 1989, a pale green that the neighbors adapted to over time. The field behind the house remained what it had been. June did not plant it or fence it differently. She left it as Thomas had known it. She told Walter once that it seemed important to keep it the same in case Thomas came back and looked for it. Walter said nothing to this, which was not the same as disagreeing. Thomas's room was closed, not locked, just closed. June cleaned it twice a year, moving carefully around the things on his desk, the things on his shelves, the Birdfield guide that he had not taken with him that morning, which she had found on the kitchen table where he must have set it before going out. She dusted it. She put it back exactly where it had been. Their daughter, Claire, was born in 1989. She arrived into a house that had already learned something fundamental about loss and about the way love continues through it. She grew up knowing about Thomas in the way the children grow up, knowing the shapes of the furniture around them as part of the given landscape of the home. She was told, when she was old enough to ask, that her brother had been taken and that no one knew where he was, and that her parents had never stopped believing he might be alive. She asked, when she was 10, whether that was true, or whether they said it because it was easier. June said it was true. Claire believed her. Walter had a habit, in the years after Thomas disappeared, of stopping his car whenever he saw a boy by the road who was approximately the right age, or approximately the right age plus the years that had passed. He never acted on these moments. He would slow, look, see the child clearly enough to understand, and drive on. He told no one. He did this for a long time. He told June eventually, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, and she said she knew because she had done the same thing. In 1994, a boy's remains were found in a creek bed in Madison County, 40 miles north of Cloverdale. He had been there for years, the medical examiner said. The age and the physical characteristics were consistent enough to require official comparison. Thomas's dental records had been in the case file since the first week of the investigation. The comparison took 9 days. The remains were not Thomas. The boy in Madison County was never identified. And June learned this result in the same call, that the remains were not Thomas and were not identified. And she sat with both pieces of information for a long time afterward. The relief and the sorrow for an unknown family somewhere who did not yet know what she knew. By 2000, Claire was 11, and the town of Cloverdale had gone through the kind of changes that towns go through across 14 years. A factory closing, a new subdivision at the edge of the county road, the old diner on the square replaced by a chain sandwich shop before eventually reopening under new ownership with much of the original menu restored. The yellow house, now green, was simply Walter and June's house. The field behind it was simply a field. But every November 7th, Walter and June did the same thing. They made breakfast together. They walked the field. They stood at the fence line for a while. Then they went back inside, and Walter called the SBI tip line number, which still rang through to a voicemail system, and left a message saying that the family of Thomas Adler was still waiting and that they wanted anyone with information to call. He did this every year for 30 years. In 1998, a man in a small town in eastern Tennessee contacted the Cloverdale Police Department and said he believed his neighbor's son might be Thomas Adler. The neighbor had moved to the area in the late 1980s with a young boy, had given the boy a different name, and had told people vague things about the boy's background that did not fully cohere. The neighbor, whose name was Gerald, was a quiet man who kept to himself and had no friends in the area as far as anyone could tell. This was the most substantial lead the case had produced in 12 years. Marsh, still with the SBI at that point, drove to Tennessee herself. She met with the local sheriff's department and they approached Gerald's property together. The boy, who was now 19 years old and going by the name Aaron, was also home. Marsh asked to speak with the boy privately. He agreed. The boy was not Thomas Adler. He was 19 years old, as he appeared to be, and had full documentation of a life that predated his arrival in Tennessee. He had been with Gerald since he was 8, following a contested custody situation from which Gerald, his uncle, had eventually been awarded informal guardianship. The situation was irregular and had caused the vagueness Gerald displayed about their history, but it was explainable, and it was not what Marsh had been hoping it was. She sat in her car outside the property for a while before driving back to Asheville. Then she drove back. In 2006, a forensic artist hired by the SBI produced an age progression image of Thomas Adler at the hypothetical age of 27, based on photographs from 1986 and the physical characteristics of his parents and maternal grandfather. The image was distributed to regional law enforcement and to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. It generated 38 tips over the following 6 months. None produced a match. In 2009, Claire Adler, by then 20 years old and studying nursing at the State University in Chapel Hill, submitted a DNA sample to the National Missing Persons Database on behalf of herself and her parents in order to establish a family reference profile that could be used for comparison. They matched nothing in the existing database. They waited there, in the system, for someone else to arrive. Dorothy Marsh retired in 2003. In her last week, she wrote a detailed summary memo on the Adler case, 9 single-spaced pages, and attached it to the front of the case file before handing it to her successor. The memo began with the date November 7, 1986, and ended with a sentence that her successor would remember long after he had read the rest of it. It said, "This case has been worked correctly and thoroughly, and the answer is still out there, and whoever reads this next should not be discouraged by the absence of resolution, because absence of resolution is not the same as absence of truth." In the spring of 2017, a man named Daniel Croft walked into a community health clinic in Knoxville, Tennessee for a routine physical. He was 38 years old, worked as an electrician, and had lived in Knoxville for 6 years after moving from a series of other places: Virginia, West Virginia, a year in Ohio, briefly back to somewhere in the Carolinas. He had no memory of his early childhood. This was not something he advertised. It was simply a fact he had lived with for as long as he could remember, a gap in his personal history that began, as best he could determine, sometime around age 7 or 8. He had been told at various points in his life by various adults in whose care he had found himself different versions of the same story. That he had had a difficult early childhood, that there had been family problems, that the details were not his to know. He had stopped asking about it in his late teens, not because the questions no longer interested him, but because none of the answers he received were satisfying, and the effort of pursuing them had costs he was not always able to absorb. At the clinic in Knoxville, a nurse practitioner named Sandra noticed, during the intake interview, that Daniel's family medical history section was almost entirely blank. She asked about it in the routine way that medical professionals ask about such things, and he gave her the routine answer he had learned to give, which was that he did not have access to his family history. She mentioned, as she had mentioned to other patients in similar situations, that several of her patients had found consumer DNA testing useful in identifying biological relatives who might have relevant medical histories. She mentioned it without pressure, as a practical suggestion. He thought about it for several months. It was not the first time someone had suggested it, and it was not the suggestion itself that moved him eventually, but something more gradual, the accumulated weight of the gap in his history and the ways it had shaped decisions he had made and not made across his adult life. In September 2017, he ordered a kit from a consumer DNA testing company. He processed it and returned it and waited. The results arrived in October. The ethnicity breakdown was unremarkable. He moved to the DNA matches section. The top match was a woman listed as a close relative, possible sibling, with a shared centimorgan count in the range that the platform described as consistent with a half-sibling or a first cousin. Her name was Claire. He did not know anyone named Claire. He clicked her profile. She had a family tree attached, marked public. He opened it. The tree was not large. 2 parents. One sibling, listed not as a branch of living relatives, but in the notation used for individuals whose status was unknown or unresolved. The sibling's name was Thomas. Dates: born 1979. Disappeared 1986, age 7. Cloverdale, North Carolina. Daniel Croft read this information several times. He was 38 years old. He had no memory before approximately age 8. He had no documentation of his early life that he had ever been able to verify as accurate. He had grown up moving from place to place in the company of adults who gave him inconsistent stories about his origins. He did not have wire-rimmed glasses. He had worn contacts since his early 20s. His hair was darker than it had been in childhood, the way hair darkens. His eyes were gray. He sat with the information for 3 days. He went to work. He came home. He looked at the family tree again. He searched Thomas Adler, Cloverdale, North Carolina, 1986. The results were thin by 2017 standards. Old newspaper digitizations, a mention on a missing persons forum that had last been updated in 2004, a brief entry in a state SBI archived case database. But there was a photograph, a school photograph from 1985 or 1986, a boy with ash-brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses and an expression of serious attention that Daniel looked at for a long time. He thought about his gray eyes. On October 19, 2017, he called the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation's cold case tip line. He spoke to an agent named Marcus Webb, who was 32 years old and had been assigned to the cold case unit for 2 years, and who had read Dorothy Marsh's summary memo and remembered the last sentence of it. Webb listened to what Daniel told him without interrupting. When Daniel finished, Webb asked if he would be willing to provide a DNA sample for official comparison against the Adler family reference profiles in the national database. Daniel said yes without hesitation. The sample was collected at a Knoxville clinic the following week and processed on an expedited basis. The comparison ran against the profile submitted by Walter, June, and Claire Adler in 2009. The result came back in 11 days. The probability that Daniel Croft was the biological child of Walter and June Adler was 99997%. Thomas Adler had been found. The man who had taken Thomas in November of 1986 was named Roy Estes. He had been 51 years old at the time of the abduction and was 82 by the time investigators located him, living in a care facility outside Bristol, Virginia, in the advanced stages of vascular dementia. He had not been on any watch list. He had no prior convictions related to children. He had worked as a long-haul truck driver for 30 years and had been largely unremarkable to everyone who knew him. The connection to Estes came not from any stored lead, but from the work of tracing Daniel's movements backward through his childhood. With Daniel's cooperation and the records that could be assembled from school enrollments, social services contacts, and the testimony of people who had known Daniel at various points, investigators built a chain. The earliest link in that chain was a man who had presented himself as Daniel's great-uncle in West Virginia in the early 1990s, who had enrolled him in school under the name Daniel Croft, who had listed no emergency contacts and no verifiable family information. Photographs of Roy Estes from the 1980s and 1990s, obtained from family members who cooperated with the investigation, matched the description given by Philip, the gas station attendant who had seen a dark truck at the gravel lot in 1986, well enough to be considered consistent. The tire impression from the pullout at Route 11 was consistent, though not conclusively matchable, with tires used on trucks of the make Estes had driven during that period. Estes could not be interviewed in any meaningful sense. He did not recognize investigators when they visited the care facility. He could not speak coherently for more than a few minutes. His physician said he had not had meaningful cognitive function for approximately 3 years. He was never charged. The evidence, while consistent, was largely circumstantial in a case where the primary witness, Thomas himself, had no memories of the events of November 1986 that could be used in any legal proceeding. The district attorney reviewed the file and made a decision that was, legally speaking, unavoidable and, humanely speaking, among the hardest decisions of her career. There would be no trial. Webb called Walter and June and Claire together in a meeting at the SBI regional office in Asheville and explained all of this before Thomas arrived. He gave them time to absorb it. He said that the legal outcome was not the whole of what had happened. He said that their son was alive and was coming to meet them. June Adler looked at the window for a moment. Then she said, "That is the part that matters." Thomas Adler, going by the name Daniel Croft, drove from Knoxville to Asheville on a Saturday in December 2017. He drove alone, which he had asked to do because he needed the time in the car to prepare himself for something that he did not know how to prepare for. He had spoken with a psychologist twice in the weeks before the meeting, a specialist in identity and memory who worked with adults in situations involving disrupted early histories. The psychologist had told him that there was no correct emotional response to what he was about to experience, and that whatever he felt was the honest response of someone encountering an overwhelming amount of new information about who he was. She said, "Go slowly and let them go slowly." He was shown to a room that was not an interview room, that had been furnished for this purpose with chairs that were comfortable and a table with water and coffee on it and windows that let in the pale December light. He sat and waited. Walter Adler was 66 years old. June was 64. Claire was 28. They arrived 10 minutes after Thomas and were brought into the room by Webb, who then stepped out and closed the door. The first thing Thomas noticed was that Claire had gray eyes. He had not expected that. Walter stood near the door for a moment after he came in. He looked at Thomas across the room in the way that a person looks when they are trying to see something they have been imagining for a very long time and are not certain the real thing will survive the comparison. Then he walked across the room and put his hand on Thomas's shoulder and said his son's name once, quietly. Thomas put his hand over his father's hand. Neither of them said anything for a moment. June was already crying, the kind of crying that is completely silent, that simply happens without sound. Claire had her arm around her mother. They came forward together, and then they were all in the same small space of the room, and the thing that had been broken for 31 years was not fixed exactly because it could not be fixed, because 31 years had happened and could not be undone. But it was different now. There was a name on the other side of it. Thomas stayed in Asheville for 4 days. He stayed with Walter and June at the greenhouse on Miller Road. He slept in the room that had been kept for him. He found his field guide on the desk. He sat at the kitchen table in the mornings the way he had sat there in the mornings when he was 7, except that he was 38 and his parents were older, and the light came in through the same window it had always come through. He did not remember the house. He had hoped he might, and he did not, but June showed him photographs, and he found that he could hold the photographs and the reality of the room in the same moment without needing them to match. Some things do not require memory to be real. Thomas spent the following year making decisions about his life that he had not expected to face. He kept his name, Daniel, for daily use, because it was the name he had lived under for 30 years, and because he felt, after some consideration, that discarding it entirely would be a further erasure of a history that had already been stripped from him once. He used Thomas with his family. Both names were his. He held them without apparent conflict, and when people asked him about it, he said simply that he was both. He moved to Asheville in the spring of 2018. He found work with an electrical contracting firm. He had dinner with Walter and June on Sunday evenings and with Claire on the occasional weeknight when their schedules allowed. He drove Miller Road sometimes, past the old field, past the pullout where Route 11 bent south, not as a ritual of grief, but as a way of making the geography his again. He went back to bird watching. He had not done it since childhood, but when Claire gave him a new field guide as a gift, he found the knowledge was still there, or some of it, in a form he could not quite call memory, but that felt like the outline of memory, a shape that his mind had kept without him. Walter Adler died in the spring of 2020, 18 months after his son came home. He had been in good health, and his death from a sudden cardiac event was unexpected in the way that sudden things are. Thomas sat with June in the days that followed and found that grief in this form was something he could share rather than carry alone. That was new for him. He had been carrying things alone for a long time. June Adler continued to live in the house on Miller Road. Thomas visited twice a week. He had a key. He used the back door sometimes, which June found on occasion briefly difficult, and then all right. Claire, who had submitted her DNA to the national database in 2009 and had checked it periodically for years without result, spoke at a missing persons advocacy conference in 2019 about the role of family DNA profiles in cold case resolution. She said that the 8 years between submitting her sample and the day her brother was found had felt like waiting for a door to open that there was no guarantee would ever open. She said the lesson she had taken from it was not that patience was always rewarded, because she knew that was not always true, but that the cost of submitting a sample and waiting was so low and the potential benefit so high that it seemed to her a clear and simple choice for any family in a similar situation. She said, "Do it, and then wait, and do not give up on the waiting." What happened to Thomas Adler on the morning of November 7, 1986, cannot be fully reconstructed because the man responsible cannot be asked, and the boy it happened to does not remember. This is a particular form of incompleteness, different from cases where the facts are known and simply terrible. The gap in the record is not a failure of investigation, but a consequence of time and human limitation, and the unreliability of dementia as a keeper of truth. What can be said is this: a 7-year-old boy walked out of his yard in the early morning cold of a November Friday with his field guide in his jacket and did not come home. And 31 years later, a 38-year-old man with no early memories and a name that was not his original one made a phone call, and a comparison was run, and the truth that had been in the database since 2009 finally had something to find. Dorothy Marsh was in her late 70s when the resolution came. Webb called her because it seemed like the right thing to do. She listened to what he told her and said thank you and did not say much else. Later, Webb would say that she had sounded, in that moment, like someone setting something down. The field guide that Thomas had left on the kitchen table in November of 1986 was still there, on the same desk in the same room, when he came back in December of 2017. June had dusted it twice a year for 31 years. It had 43 species marked in large, careful printing, the annotations of a 7-year-old who had found the world worth naming. He opened it in his old room on the first night he stayed in the house. He read through it slowly, recognizing the birds more than the handwriting. He sat with it for a while. Then he set it back on the desk and turned off the light and went to sleep in the room that had been kept for him, in the house on Miller Road that had been yellow once and then green, while the November dark settled over the field outside where he had watched birds 31 years before. He was home. It was not the same as it had been. Nothing was, but he was home. If this story reached you, subscribe and share it. More stories are coming that take their time because the subjects deserve that.